to Medieval Radio, Past Perfect, the talk show about medieval and early modern culture.
Hello and welcome to Past Perfect, CU Medieval Radio's podcast on all things late antique, medieval and early modern. My name is Ivan Milekovic and today I'm joined by Professor Basema Hamarneh. Professor Hamarneh holds the chair for late antique and early Christian archaeology at the University of Vienna. Much like the name of her chair, Professor Hamarneh unites the two concepts, late antiquity and early Christian archaeology, in her research on the visual and material culture of the Christian Middle East. Professor Hamarneh, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Let's start with this very peculiar concept of interaction between late antique and early Christian archaeology. We'll touch upon this subject later of how early Christian archaeology developed into a broader field. But maybe let's go to your own research. So you're dealing with the Middle East, with Jordan and Palestine, but peculiarly enough, I think that when we say the Middle East or when we say Jordan, we will think of Muslim visual culture, of the Islamic world, even in context of late antiquity. But as your research deals with early Christianity in these areas, and especially with the visual culture and mosaics and so on, could you tell us a bit, how does this very peculiar area of early Christianity develop? And what is the relationship between Islam, paganism, Judaism, and all these different religions? And how does this formulate the material and visual culture of this region?
Thank you very much for this question. This is an excellent way of putting it. I feel very much that the mosaics that are discovered in the Levant reflect an extremely wide chronological range. Now, they begin from the 2nd century BCE, and they continue basically until the decline of floor mosaics in the 8th century CA. This, of course, enables us to trace a remarkable continuity and change along this diachronic axis. Different religious communities such as pagans, Jews, Christians, and Muslims not only shared motifs and iconographies, but even exercised mutual influences. Although in cases communities defended their identity as distinct from the other community, but this should not be seen as a sign of struggle or conflict, but rather as an expression of adaptation and adjustment. Well, I can also add that sometimes the same patterns appear in synagogues, churches, and mosques as an expression of a shared cultural value. For example, the personifications of the four seasons, they appear in pagan, Jewish, and Christian floors, where they are included under a form of plants, garlands, and fruits in the mosques, and as human figures in the private realm of Muslim patrons. So as a whole, differences are provided by the meaning and the function of the mosaics within an architectural setting. So whether it is a synagogue, a church, a private house, or a mosque.
And again, speaking about the Middle East and these interactions, specifically interactions between the Muslims and the Christians, one would also think of iconoclasm. But could you maybe tell us, how does this iconoclastic iconography develop, and does it really develop only because of the interactions between Muslims and Christians? And you also mentioned the floral mosaics which exist until the 8th century. Could you tell us a bit, why did they stop existing and how does this transformation happen?
Yes, well, I will start with the first question. We cannot speak of iconoclasm in the Levant. We should speak of iconophobia. Iconophobia is a very specific aspect of mosaic floors when we see basically the patterns showing animated subjects, that is humans and animals. We see the figures, the body shape remains basically, but all the tesserae that composes the body or features of the face were plucked out and then reinserted in a very scrambled form, leaving a lot of information for us today to identify the motifs that were there before, because this kind of intervention was not complete. That means it left just, for example, the limbs, arms, legs of human figures, parts of the bodies of animals, or even the contour of the body, and you can really read these images. So I would not see this pixelation, if we would like to use this term, I would not see this pixelation as proper destruction. There is a change of attitude towards figurative image, and this appears basically in all Semitic cultures, not only by Christians and Muslims, but basically in all Semitic cultures. There is no order from the religious authorities of the Muslims that at that time ruled by the Umayyads in the Levant to destroy images. This is something that originates within the Christian communities themselves. There is a kind of fear of being accused of idolatry or of being pagans. And if we look at, let's say, the Christian literature of that time, there's a lot of discussion about the end of the world. So people are afraid of the end of the world. They start changing their floors in order to respond to a more general idea of Christianity, but not connected to the human figure. The second question that you asked me is, why do we speak about a decline or demise in the 8th century? Basically, these dates that I mentioned, the 8th century, are provided by floors that are dated. And in Jordan, we have several cases. At least we have 3 floors that featured humans and animals that were set around the first or the second decade of the 8th century. So we know that until that time, figurative imagery was well accepted. Then, in the second half of the 8th century, these figures are not accepted anymore. So it is properly the Christian community that wishes to allow worshippers to go into the church, but without looking anymore on images on the floor.
You mentioned that this response towards figurative art comes from the inside of the Christian community and not from the Umayyads. But this prompts me to ask you, how did these Umayyads and how did these Islamic rulers perceive the Christians, and is there any influence on the material culture of the state framework, which is now Islamic and not Christian, compared to the previous one?
This is also a very good question, because the earliest rulers of the Umayyads, the earliest Islamic rulers, they integrated Christians and Jews as part of the community of believers. The Islamic Caliph presented himself as the prince of the believers. So he united in this concept and accepted in this concept Christians and Jews together with Muslims. So at a certain point, Islam changes, and it's not anymore of the believers. It's not anymore Amir al-Mu'minin, but he becomes the Caliph of an Islamic realm. So this comes only with the Abbasids. It comes later on, and I think it is connected also with antagonisms with Byzantium and the attempts to capture Constantinople and political struggle within Islam, but it has nothing to do with the early Islam, which was extremely tolerant and extremely open. And as such, Muslim rulers have accepted and have absorbed the decorative culture of classicism. If we see the early monuments of Islam, we see this very strong influence of classicism in sculpture, in art, in mosaics. And I must add that not only, well, let's say that mosques remained very neutral in terms of decorative elements. I mean, they used a lot of plants, geometric decorations, inscriptions in their mosaics, whereas in the private houses, or for example, the best known example is Qusayr Amra in Jordan, which features human figures, even in bathing female naked figures. And that is part also of the culture. A very strong influence of Christian and classical art, but in a private context, it becomes much more open. So there is no, the difference comes only in public buildings. And we must remember that for the Christians at the time of the Umayyads, the churches were the sole public buildings. There were no municipia, there were no, let's say, provincial governmental structures, because, of course, with the Muslims, the provincial government and everything was changed. So churches were the public buildings. They're the places where communities converged. So as such, they were respected and allowed to exist and, of course, continue to be built and redecorated and decorated, of course.
And apart from this political integration of different religious groups and decorative adaptation of classical culture, are there maybe acts of spoliation, of Muslim spoliation of Jewish and Christian material? Or how, if, for example, a church or a synagogue transforms into a mosque, what are the modalities of these transformations?
Well, the transformations of churches to mosques, as the transformations of pagan temples to churches, is not something that appears or that comes immediately. It is a very long process. In the Umayyad period, we do not have any such thing. We have transformations or the use of parts of Christian buildings as mosques indicates that there was shared culture. For example, we know that Muslims went to shrines that were dedicated to biblical figures because Islam integrated biblical figures as part of their pantheon, if I may use the term pantheon. So a biblical figure like Elias, for example, Moses, or Aaron were still places where also Muslims went because they also believed in these prophets. And they left sometimes graffiti. For example, in the church of the monastery of San Lot in Deir Ain Ambata, that is not far from the Dead Sea, that commemorates the place where Lot and his daughters took refuge, a graffiti was found which starts with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and then it says, God forgive Jarir his sins. So Jarir was a Muslim who went to a Christian building, left a graffiti which acknowledges the fact that he knew the destination of the place, but he is not a Christian. He visited the site and he left a graffiti, which provides us an idea of this kind of mutual pilgrimage of Christians and Muslims to the same places.
This is all very fascinating, but I'm speaking about the Middle East and and different interactions in the Middle East. One cannot mention the cult of saints, which undoubtedly developed on the Eastern Mediterranean. And then, in that sense, I would like to ask you something about the project in which you were one of the primary investigators, about the life of the Holy Fools and the usage of topography in order to understand hagiography. In this sense, what I would actually like to ask you, because many archaeologists use written sources in order to maybe understand some material and visual culture, but many philologists or historians who are textual based do not really use material culture in order to understand the texts. So where would you see this relationship between texts and material culture, and how can one help us understand the other?
Well, one must think of for whom the writer writes. Okay, so if a hagiographic text is written in order to appeal to a certain public in a certain area, that is locally prepared hagiography, they use some material evidence in order to root the story in a true setting. Sometimes these saints can be invented, like you mentioned the story of the Holy Fools. I have worked on two hagiographic texts. The first is of Saint Simeon the Holy Fool, and the second one is that of Andrew. The texts differ by chronological setting because one text is written in the beginning of the 7th century, but it is set in the time of Justinian. The second text is modeled upon the first one, that is the life of Andrew. It is probably written in medieval Constantinople in the 10th century, but the setting is late antique. So we know that because the text of the life of Andrew describes Constantinople. The person who wrote the text, who presents himself as Nicephorus, priest of Hagia Sophia, who is an invented figure. We do not know who he is. He is probably from Constantinople. He describes his city. So he sets his saints in different places of the city. So we can really follow his movements. But there are some elements that betray a different chronological setting. So that is, it tells us that it is medieval from some small elements that we can find, although the setting is really, they tried their best to put it in a late antique. So how do we use these texts? Of course, we have to keep in mind that these texts are not geographic texts, they are not historical, they're not, so as to say, they're not real sources because they contain a lot of legendary material, a lot of information, a lot of other things. So we have to treat them as such, but we have to take the material evidence. For example, in the life of Saint Simeon, the Holy Fool, Leontios of Neapolis describes how Simeon comes from the city of Edessa in Syria. He goes to Jerusalem with a party with his mother and a party of other people. They go on pilgrimage. They want to go to the feast of the dedication of the Holy Sepulchre. They perform all the rituals. And then while in Jerusalem, he meets another party coming from Syria. So these two people befriend, and so Simeon and John, this new companion, decide to descend towards the Dead Sea. And our hagiographer describes how the route from Jerusalem to Jericho, and we know that it actually descends towards the Dead Sea. At a certain point, the two men decide to go to the monastery of Euphemius. So they go to the monastery where they ask for the prior of the monastery, Nikon, to allow them to become members of the monastery, to become monks. They receive the habitus, and then they go to the desert where they spend 20 years before Simon's return again to Emesa. So there are a lot of informations regarding the environment, feasts, the aspects of these monasteries, the way, the topographic setting of some elements that are clearly very interesting for us as archaeologists to reconstruct these sites and these places. And of course, each hagiographic text has a small element of truth, and we have to take this elements of truth and use it in the best way we can.
I think this is an excellent introduction to the next topic because it speaks about methodology and how does one approach this. But what I would like to ask you, and I think that your biography perfectly fits into this, is you have two doctorates, should be worth mentioning. One is from Sapienza, so from a secular institution. The other one is in Christian archaeology proper from the Pontifical Institute. And this is a topic I would like to discuss. So how does the discipline of early Christian and late antique archaeology develop? If I'm correct, the late antique in the name of the chair at University of Vienna was added in 2016. So in your opinion, in your experience, could you tell us something about where are these boundaries? And should Christian archaeology and early Christian archaeology be used only for biblical scholars and different types of theologians? Or should it expand to the wider religious, social, cultural environment? And if yes, how?
Well, this is a very interesting question indeed. I think that by labeling the chair where I work now in the University of Vienna, late antique and early Christian, would somehow includes all these elements. That is, late antiquity does embrace early Christianity. It is not something different. But according to the historical development of the discipline, if we look at the development of discipline of Christian archaeology, we see that it starts in Rome and in many other places in the world as connected to the faculty of theology. So within theology, the need or the intention to understand the early roots of Christianity, well, it begins there. It begins with the texts. And then it goes towards the context. The Pontifical Institute in Rome basically deals with Rome, so the Christian catacombs, the churches, and then slowly it started to englobe all aspects of early Christianity in the Christian oikumene, so that is in the whole context of Christianity. But still, we have to think also of Byzantine archaeology. Where does that fit? Does that fit with Christian archaeology? Does that fit with late antiquity? Is it a completely different branch of knowledge? So we have to see all these elements methodologically as connecting. We cannot take Christian archaeology aside without thinking of classicism. We cannot think of early Christianity in the Levant without speaking of Byzantine archaeology. So it doesn't matter how you name it. The main thing is that you follow the right methodology of looking at it, not trying to see, okay, early Christianity goes from here to here and then I stop. I'm not looking in one direction. I will not look in the other direction. So it should not be the small context. One should try to look at the larger picture.
On that note, and speaking about the larger picture, we, I think, should mention the case of Musli, who was one of the pioneers of early Christian archaeology in Vienna. And oddly enough, he also taught Arabic.
Yes.
So is there some pattern of early Christian archaeologists, late antique archaeologists also being connected to Arabic? But what I would actually like to ask is, how does early Christian archaeology fit into the Oriental studies, Middle East, Arabic studies, or however we label them?
As working in the Levant, Arabic is one of the key languages. Like if you work on Christian archaeology, you must know Italian, for example, because most of the literature, the early literature or much of the bulk of literature is in Italian, for example. So the knowledge of languages is instrumental to understand. And you can't work on archaeology if you do not know, or at least archaeology in the Levant, if you do not know, for example, Greek, if you don't know Arabic, Syriac is a plus. So there are a lot of aspects, linguistic aspects, that help you to understand. And not only the culture of late antiquity is rooted in these elements, because, for example, many lives of saints, starting from the 8th century, and monasteries become more and more Arabic-speaking and Syriac-speaking. We have texts that are translated to Arabic that also provide us of information on local environment, interactions between Christians and Muslims and Jews in the area, for example. So it is important. How does the subject relate to Middle Eastern studies and to Arabic linguistics and so on? I mean, we share a lot. We have a lot in common. Of course, I'm not a philologist. People working on Middle Eastern studies or they have probably different methodologies than I do because they have different research questions. My research questions are more connected to material culture, excavations, built monuments, visual culture. So the language is an instrument, is the key sometimes. And working in an environment like with the excavation in Jordan, knowing Arabic is very important.
On a similar note, you mentioned Byzantine studies. Where does one fit early Byzantine archaeology? I was told by a colleague from CEU that there was a course on Byzantine literature which started from the beginning. And I said, which beginning? They said, the 9th century, of course. But what about the earlier? And for example, an art historian, in most places, in Europe at least, art history starts from Justinian onwards. And earlier, everything before that is archaeology. And then the problem is that classical archaeology ends somewhere in the 2nd century. So there's this field of four centuries of material and visual culture that is quite often not covered by at least curriculums. In this sense, I'd like to stay with art history, for example. Of course, in Europe, until recently, there was no such discipline as classical art history. There was classical archaeology, which was art history. And there was art history, which was Middle Ages onwards. Now there's maybe a separation, but with late antiquity, it seems to me that art history and archaeology are deeply connected still. There's really no separation of the two. So would you say that, first, how would you comment on these developments? And would you say that this is a good fit? And should an archaeologist separate art history, or should an art historian separate every other aspect of material culture?
Well, I would start first with periodization. Which period do I cover in my teaching? I usually start with the tetrarchy, because I feel strongly that under the Tetrarchs, the division of the empire into East and West had remarkably set the ground for the later development and Constantine's changes by providing the ground for religious tolerance. I continue until the 8th century. My limit is the 8th century, but that is only in teaching because I also work a little bit beyond. I arrive up to the 10th century in many cases, but that is very important because you have to cover a very long durée, that you cannot cut history with a knife and say, okay, Justinian is the last Roman emperor, and then we start from Justinian, but that is not true because Justinian was not the last Roman emperor, and it was not even Heraclius. And one should be really very open to include as much as possible, because a historical development is a long durée. So speaking of art history, indeed, what do art histories study? Okay, if we want to talk about artists as such, we do not have such thing in late antiquity. We have artisans. If we take mosaics, we started our talk with mosaics, and mosaics are very interesting from that point of view. Who were the mosaicists? Who were the people who made these floors? Were they artists or were they artisans? Is there any division? Well, we can answer this question by looking again at inscriptions, because few inscriptions provide us with the names of these people, but we have to match also seasonality. When did these mosaics, when were they produced? We notice that most of these mosaics were made during the winter months, which means that these people were not professional artists. They were people who worked probably in other professions like agriculture, and in the winter months when there was no agricultural works needed, they made mosaics, or they worked in quarries. They provided this kind of artisanal work. Same stands true for icons. Who were the icon painters? Do we know them? Are they professional artists? Or they're just monks, or, for example, people living in monasteries who are very skilled in painting, and they would do that in a certain period of time during the year. We do not have names. Art history looks on artists, professional artists. So at a certain point of time, we and art history are very closely connected. But then with Renaissance, Morocco, this completely changes. We have professional artists who live from their art, who produce art, and they do only that. Whereas in our case, art is an expression of human dialogue with nature. It's an expression of religious commitment. It is an expression of something else, but we do not have the professional artist, so as to say. I don't know if that is clear, but I'm happy to return on the subject in case.
I'd agree. I did my undergraduate degree, which is formally art history and archaeology, and I always insisted that I'm not an art historian because I'm not dealing with art, because there is no such thing as art until at least late Middle Ages. And I'd agree with this. But you also mentioned something at the very end of your answer, forms of expression, forms of communication. You, of course, spoke with shared religious spaces between Muslims and Christians, which I think is a subject which is nowadays very popular when we speak about the political situation in the Middle East. To connect to something we spoke before the start of the interview, would you say that late antique archaeology has wider social relevance? And how does one actually apply this and use it?
The social relevance of late antiquity comes, if we look at the Levant, it's a great lesson to all of us, because we have to remember that tolerance, coexistence between religions is possible. People can live together in peace. They can work together. They can create things together. And these divisions are artificial divisions that we create today with our myopia, our geopolitical views, our, let's say, other interests that come into play. Of course, late antiquity was not always flowers and and love songs. I mean, there were also conflicts, of course. We should not forget that there were also conflicts, but they were dealt with, but it was possible. So we have to learn this, that coexistence is possible, learning from each other is possible, mutually influencing each other is possible. And that comes, of course, it's a lesson. It's a lesson for us to learn.
As much as we have to learn from historical lessons of this kind, I think that the discipline should also learn from historical lessons, as we touched upon during our talk. But I would like to connect to something. We did an interview with Peter Brown recently, and he said that much of his thinking about late antiquity is Vienna's fault, because he was reading Riegel, he was reading Strzykowski, and then he realized there is something in here. And he started from art history. He said that his world of late antiquity is an art book. But aside from that, Vienna seems as a very important topos, as a very important place in the development of late antique studies, with names such as Riegel, Strzykowski, but also Mosley and so on. So in this sense, and you also wrote about the history of Viennese school, how much would you say that this Vienna school as such influenced the development of the subject?
I think that the great innovation of the Vienna school comes from the fact that they started looking east. Because if much of the knowledge was Western-based or came from the look from the West towards the East, and everything what came from the East was labeled as provincial, let's say awkward, not interesting art, because it starts from there, it starts from the aesthetics. Looking at the East allowed people to see that the influences, the connections, came also from the Eastern Mediterranean. So we cannot study late antique art or archaeology by looking only on the catacombs. That would be a mistake. We have to take it as a global thought, because late antique world was much more global than we imagine it today. We think that people in the East just lived there and the people in the West just stayed there. But that is not true, because we know that there was a very strong mobility. Now, the Roman army moved all over the Mediterranean. We find inscriptions of people coming from the most diverse places in other cities or in other places that we did not even expect to find them. Same stands true for bishops. Bishops traveled all over. We know that important bishops came from North Africa to the West. Other bishops traveled in the East. Peter the Iberian, who was originally from modern Georgia, he spent a lot of time in Constantinople at the court, or the imperial court of Constantinople, and then he became the bishop of Gaza. So he traveled a lot, and then he moved. We know that these people had very big mobility, and that stands true for all others. So, for example, a small city like Madaba, which is a dot in the late antique world, and even in the classical time, it was an unknown place, has produced the most incredible map of the biblical land. That the map included the frontiers from Lebanon to Egypt up to the Mediterranean Sea. So one would say such skillful mosaicists who made a map of the ancient world, showing us the buildings, the Holy Sepulchre of the Constantinian period, which is one of the earliest sources that we have, and the earliest map of the Bible, of the land of the Bible, and of Christian pilgrimage in a mosaic, really comes from a small place. Well, one would say, and it's very accurate geographically. So one would say, how come? People moved, they traveled. And as such, late antiquity and late antique, well, what to say, art, okay, we can say art, comes also from the East, not only from the West. So what did Riegel do? Riegel did look at this aspect. Unfortunately, he died only 47 years of age, and let alone, of course, the ideas of Stregowski that can be really borderline in some aspects, But let's look at the fact that they brought something new. They brought a fresh vision. And as such, Vienna School must be credited for this.
But on this notion of globality, which started in the Viennese school, you said East. Of course, the East Mediterranean, but how east would you say that this East goes? And should then late antique archaeology also expand towards, of course, Caucasus, but China, India, and such places? And should all of this be integrated into a single discipline?
I think that we should not overlook China, India, and the Far East. It is important because people, things, mobility moved also along the Silk Road. And the Silk Road, we know, has brought a lot of interesting things towards. For example, we know that in an excavation in Palmyra, a piece of silk, Chinese silk, was found. The same silk was found in a reliquary in Italy. The same piece of silk, divided. So, isn't that mobility of things, objects, people, ideas? The thing is that we do not integrate China into our studies, probably from our, let's say, myopia, but it would not be even a bad idea to have such disciplines or provide students of possibility to learn more about China in late antiquity and India and the Far East.
Do you have students who are interested in material culture but who are not students of classical archaeology? So students of Byzantine studies or philologists, theologians, do they come? Are they interested in this?
Well, yes, some do come. Some do come to lectures and to seminars. I have a very good collaboration with my colleagues in different departments of the university, and I think that it is very interesting to see, for example, young students approaching the subject and even coming to excavations. So yes, I feel very open to integrate students coming from different disciplines who are willing to learn something new or something more about late antiquity or the way I see late antiquity, because clearly it is always, we're provided with a personal flavor. So each of us working in high education knows that it's not simply providing students with notions, but it's providing them with ideas and help them to develop their own vision and invite them to think and to have questions, to ask questions. And not always we can answer these questions, but it's good to have questions, to be curious, to be open, and to learn. That's the best thing one can do. And I'm really happy when I see students coming from art history or from Byzantine studies or from theology, even from Eastern Arabic studies. So there is a good mix.
I think that this is then an exceptional finale, because truly I agree that late antiquity is not a stiff subject. And so, not being a stiff subject, we can surely go on with this talk for ages and ages, but we are well into the first hour. So I would like to thank you for joining us and thank you for illuminating the world of late antiquity for us.
Thank you very much for inviting.